Hey there, and welcome back to Bioethics. So I want to start out with, again, housekeeping. So two things. One has to do with your journals. I've had several questions that I thought I might give answers to publicly so everybody can benefit from them. One question in particular is whether you have one or two journal entries due each week. And the answer is you can break it up however you want. It would be good for me if you used headings in the journal, like if you were reflecting on a particular reading to put a heading and say which reading you were sort of thinking about as you wrote this. But I just want you to reflect on the readings. So there's not every in particular one, but like, a fair majority of them. Like if you skip a particular court ruling or a particular like code of ethics that I just had you read, that's not a big deal. But the major readings that are fairly long, 10 pages or more, I want some reflection on those. So at the end of the week, I'll check it, and I'd like to see you hit the majority of the readings and have some substantive, reflective thoughts on it. And it would help me to do that if you either broke it up by like day for which you were doing the reflections, or just had headings so I knew like, oh, that's what they read and that's what they thought about. But I'm it's going to be hard to not get a good grade on that. I'm going to give you some feedback soon. At the end of this week is when I'm going to start checking journals, and I'll check them every week at the end of every week. And I'm going to start giving some feedback, and you'll almost certainly get feedback saying, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. Maybe tweak it this way or format it this way in the future to make it a little easier for me to scan and make sure you're hitting all the points. But once you get that feedback, I think you'll feel a lot more confident, and you'll get that after the end of this week. So maybe by Monday or so, which means Monday at midnight, because I work late because I spend most of my day taking care of other people. The second thing is has to do with, what was it? Wait, it's not journals. It was the sign-up sheet. So I've posted the sign-up sheet for your supplemental reading presentations, and I only need you to sign up for one of those presentations. We'll handle the second presentation and talk about what we're going to do for that after everybody's signed up for this one. But just to sign up for one, it's first come, first serve, and the texts for your presentation are available to you in if you click the Files tab when you're in like the Teams chat area, or the not chat, but what do they call it, channels, and you just click the Files tab when you're in the general channel. It'll take you to a file folder, and in that should be another folder that says supplemental readings, and you can download the reading that's listed for your presentation, or the readings. Some of you have multiple readings for your presentation there. If it's not in there, email me or chat me, or just point it out in one of the channels, and I'll see it and I'll get it to you. But I think they're all there. There's at least 81 files there, and I think that's more than the presentations. So there's a few extra files that are in there too, but that shouldn't get in the way. Okay, housekeeping done. I have three recommendations for you. Like, I thrive off of teaching with like people in the room and sort of an informal, like relaxed discussion, real world setting. And this is not that, but something I normally do in my classes. If like I've found something good that week that I think other people would enjoy, like a movie or an album or whatever it is, I'll just suggest it, and we'll talk about things that we like. It's a good conversation starter. But I have three suggestions for you. A movie I watched this week. It's on Hulu, but you could download it or watch it some other way, I think. And it's called Marrowbone. It's surprisingly good if you're into like psychological thrillers and sort of period pieces. It's something like if you took Downton Abbey and made it sort of a horror story, but also made it sort of like Anne of Green Gables-y or something. I don't know. But it's really, really good. So if you need to kill 2 hours this week, go watch Marrowbone. Marrowbone. One word. The second thing is a game that I've been playing on my phone. I don't play a lot of games on my phone, but I've become completely addicted to one, and it's called From Cells to Singularity. I think it might just be called Cells on the phone because that name is so long. But yeah, From Cells to Singularity. And it's like this clicking game where you basically, it simulates all of human history starting from the beginning of evolution of life on the planet all the way through like the technological age that we're in now, and to a future age where technology has become very different, and it is fascinating. And there's anything you're interested in has some sort of like little fragment in that game that you can touch on, and it's not hard. You just sort of click through and make strategic decisions about how to spend these little points that you have to make society roll forward or evolution roll forward. And it's free, and you learn things on it, and it just makes my mind blow. I was playing it the other night, and I heard my roommate's alarm go off, and I realized that it was 4 in the morning, and I had been playing for like 4 hours. It's just, I shouldn't do that, and neither should you. But this is a compelling game, and it makes you do that. The third recommendation is, what was the third recommendation? It wasn't an app. It wasn't a show. Oh, it's an app, not a game. It's an app called NewsGuard, and you can install it either on your phone or as a browser plugin on your laptop. And what it does, it's also free. And what it does is for every news story that you see, if you're looking in your browser or I think through AdGuard on your phone or NewsGuard on your phone, it puts a little symbol next to it that it tells you whether it's a fairly trustworthy or not very trustworthy news source. And if you click on that symbol, it gives you this long, detailed report about, they call it the nutrition facts or something about the news source, and they tell you like who owns it and who runs it, and whether they have a history of making false claims or whether they're even transparent about where they get their funding from, blah, 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 blah. You can learn everything about a news source by clicking on that little symbol. I found it super useful and accurate and honest, and it doesn't seem to harbor a lot of biases. And, being able to tell what news is trustworthy is like a very serious problem right now. So I highly recommend NewsGuard. Okay, so let's move on to the lecture. We're going to talk about moral theories. You read about them in the reading. If you didn't do the reading, go do that and then come back to this, because this won't make all that much sense if you didn't. We're going to talk about moral theories, and I want to structure this overview of these moral theories in the following way. Like, what moral theories try to do is try to tell you, here's what's the most fundamentally important thing to think about when you're making a moral decision. They sort of tell you, here's what morality is about. Like, imagine it this way. Like, if a kid said to you, why is stealing wrong? Each moral theory wants to tell you, like, what it is that makes stealing wrong, or murder wrong, or lying wrong, and it wants to tell you what makes good acts, like giving to the poor, or being honest, or being kind to your spouse, what makes those things good. They sort of try to tell you the very central, like, most important thing. And there should be like one central most important thing to all of morality, because we say this act is bad and this act is bad and this act is bad, right? Morality tells us these things are bad and these things are good, and good and bad are just opposites. So if all of these things are the same thing, bad, or the same thing, good, then goodness should be consistent among all of them. What makes them all good should have something to do with each other. They should all be kind of good for the same general reason, bad for the same general reason. It's not very satisfying if the kid asked you, why is stealing wrong? And you said, well, imagine if somebody stole from you, you wouldn't like it. And then they said, why is murder wrong? And you said, well, because it violates their right to live. Well, now you've got two very different explanations of wrongness that don't seem to coincide, the kid's now confused and they're going to say, okay, well, if I wouldn't want it done to me, that makes it wrong. And also, if it infringes upon another person's right to live, then it's wrong. But why are both of those things wrong now? Like, what's the thing that binds them together and makes them wrong? You could do the same sort of analysis for goodness. So each of these moral theories wants to tell you what that one thing is. And in doing that, they're trying to tell you, here's how you should think. In every moral situation, whenever you're making a morally difficult choice, here's the thing you should think about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down, I think I'm doing it as 5 different theories or viewpoints on ethics. And I'm going to kind of structure my overview of each of them in the same way. I'm going to tell you what that central thing is that they say is, that theory says is the central foundation of morality. And I'm going to illustrate it through an example. I'm going to use the same example in each of these cases. And that example is, I want it to be something that everybody can relate to and everybody's interested in. And sex is almost the only thing that fits those 2 criteria. So sexual ethics are going to be the example that I use across them. And then I'm going to sum it up by telling you, here's how this theory says, here's what you should think about in every moral situation. The one thing, or the one concept or set of concepts that you should think about in every situation. Okay, so the first theory or category of theories, we can call them either. The first theory, the general kind of theory in ethics, is called deontology. I don't know exactly how to explain the etymology of that word. It's like a complex mash of like Greek and Latin, I think. But you don't need to know why it's called deontology. That's just the name that sort of survived. But what deontology is most says is most fundamental to all of morality is rules, sets of rules. That morality is at the very bottom, spelled out through a set of rules, or just one rule. So this may sound like obvious to you, because we all are taught morality in a sort of deontological way from the time that we're born. We ask why is something good or bad, and you sort of get the golden rule explanation. The golden rule is a sort of baby talk deontology theory, because it says morality is all about doing to others as you'd have them do unto you. As we saw last time, that's not a very good rule, because it would let all sort of like weird psychos, hook batteries up to you if that's what they wanted you to do to them, or whatever. But it even though it's a bad form of moral theory, it doesn't mean it's not a moral theory. So it counts as as deontology, the golden rule view. There are more sophisticated versions of this. A lot of religious ethics, almost all religious viewpoints on ethics are deontological. Take the biblical law in the Old Testament. It is spelled out clearly in a set of literal rules. And if that counts as morality, that's about the closest concept they had to morality at that time, or in that culture at least. And it's spelled out clearly in rules. So if you break the rules, you're doing the wrong thing, and if you follow the rules, you're doing the right thing. So let's see. You could sort of spell out Muslim or Islamic ethics in a similar way. It doesn't have to be religious though. Deontological views can be secular. Like most people sort of, when I talked about last time how people kind of conflate the law and morality in our culture, that would be a sort of deontology that says, well, if something's wrong, it's because it violated some law or some rule that we've already all implicitly agreed to follow. So let's illustrate these. I said I'm going to use sexual ethics as the sort of consistent illustrator for all of these theories. So let's take an issue like homosexuality. Whether homosexuality is right or wrong, or homosexual practices are right or wrong, is going to be determined in this case, if deontology is the framework we're working within, by whether the rules say anything about it. if you're a Christian, you might point to various verses in the Bible that say that men shouldn't lie with each other the way men and women lie with each other. And so it's clearly wrong if you interpret those passages to mean just basic sexuality. There are other ways to interpret those passages, but if that's your interpretation, then you have a rule that tells you that this is wrong. Or if you live in a secular society that has laws that say homosexuality is illegal or homosexual sex is illegal, then you have a clear deontological viewpoint that says it's wrong. If you live in a society that doesn't have any rule, religious or otherwise, then you assume it's fine, it's permissible, we could say, in ethics. Now, this raises the problem that each society has its own sets of rules, right? You might ask, why should I prefer one set of rules over the other? Even in a religious case, God gives you a set of rules, maybe, but a smart, sort of ethically minded person could ask, why should I follow God's rules? Like, what makes those rules the right ones? Could he explain to me, other than, like, did he just randomly choose these rules? Or could he explain to me, like, these rules are good because blah, blah, blah? And in which case, the explanation for why they're good moral rules is not because God commanded them. He commanded them because they're already good moral rules, and he'd have to give some explanation of that. To say, well, God said to do it, that's why it's good, isn't a very convincing explanation. I mean, maybe it'll convince you to do it because God has the power to send you to hell. That's sort of like saying, you should do it or I'm going to beat the hell out of you, right? That's in one sense a convincing reason to do something, but in another, it's like it doesn't show me that I really should do it in a moral sense. And each society and each religion have their different rules. There's this really nice anecdote about King Darius, who was a king of a Greek city-state before Greece unified and became its own thing. But King Darius is a smart sort of dude, and he's talking to the men in his court, and he says, "Look, all these moral rules that we have, all of our moral viewpoints are a product of the way our culture works, and there's no big set of rules that applies to every culture." And he gives an example. He brings in some people, the Circassians, I think, and the Greeks. There's people from, I think this one group is from Ethiopia. They're a completely different culture than the Greek people. And he says to the Greek people, he says, "What do you do when your father dies? What do you do with the body?" And the Greeks say, "Well, we burn it." And the Ethiopians are like, "Oh, you burn your father? That's so disrespectful." And Darius asks the Ethiopians, "Well, what do you do with your father when he dies?" They say, "Well, we eat them to make them part of us again." And the Greeks are obviously like, "You just turn them into food?" But this illustrates the different rules we have. And Darius sort of thinks there's no way to settle the issue. You just have to go with the culture that you're born into. He's also the guy who he quips and says, if lions had gods, they'd look like lions, and snakes had gods, they'd look like snakes, and we sort of create our own rules or our own moral viewpoint to suit ourselves. Maybe that's true, but we can at least agree that some moral rules seem a lot better than other moral rules. Like if somebody told you their religion says that, I'll use an example, Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance, have a moral injunction against accepting blood transfers or blood transfusions. That's a moral rule in their culture and in their religion. From the outside, to me, that seems like a pretty bad moral rule. It doesn't seem to benefit anybody. It doesn't seem to do any good. It doesn't seem to avoid any bad sort of thing. So, why? It seems like, strike one for Jehovah's Witnesses moral rule view. But then if I don't like the moral view, if I think it's a bad moral rule, then I must be using some standard other than the rules that I'm given. And that's not deontology. Deontology says everything can be summed up in moral rules or moral maxims. A maxim is like a phrase that commands you to do something, tells you what to do. So the biggest thinker or most important figure in deontological ethics is a guy named Immanuel Kant. You may have heard of him in other courses that touched on philosophical figures or important Western thinkers or something. And Immanuel Kant puts forward probably the most plausible and brilliant formulation of deontology, where he says, look, all of morality can be summed up in a single rule. And he says, here's the rule. It's not a rule telling you what to do. It's a rule telling you which rules to follow. It's a rule about selecting rules. So it's a meta rule. So here's Kant's meta rule. He says, follow those rules that you could wish everybody followed. Let's say it again. He says, the moral rule is a meta rule about which rules to follow, and it's this. Follow those moral rules that you could wish everybody would follow. Let me give you an example. If you kill somebody, you're saying, if you think it's okay to kill somebody, or just if you kill somebody, it seems like you're embodying this idea that there's not a rule against killing somebody. You're not following the rule, right? Or you're saying there is no such rule. There's a rule that says killing people is permissible. You're sort of embodying that rule. Well, what if everybody followed that rule and just went out and killed everybody? Then there'd be no people, and they couldn't even follow the rule anymore. So it becomes just, reality breaks down if everybody follows that rule. Lying is similar. If you think there's a rule that says it's okay for you to lie, Kant says, then everybody can lie. And then language breaks down because we don't even know if when people speak a sentence, if they mean for it to be true or not. But if you follow the rule that says you shouldn't lie, and you imagine a world where everybody follows that rule, it's like a pretty nice world. And if you follow the rule that says you shouldn't murder people, and everybody follows that rule, if you imagine a world where everybody follows that rule, it's like a pretty nice world. So Kant says that's how you know which rules to follow, is you follow my meta rule. And that meta rule is the center of morality for Kant. For a sort of simple religious ethic that says it's the Ten Commandments or something, it's not some big meta rule. It's just a list of moral rules of what not to do and what to do. And that's all of morality. So deontology says, in the end, when you're trying to make a moral decision, the thing you should think about is which rules there are and which apply to your particular circumstance. So to go back to the sexual ethics thing, when you're asking, is homosexuality wrong, or is sleeping with my partner outside of marriage wrong, or is having sex just for fun without any intent of procreating, is that wrong or right, or what should I do in this situation? Just the deontologist will say, just consider the list of moral rules that you think apply to all of humans, and see if there's any rule on there that says it. This, of course, is all going to depend on which set of moral rules that you follow. And deontology generally does not tell you which set is right, and it just presupposes that there is some set of rules that you follow. Okay, so let's move on to our second kind of moral theory. Seeing the difference between deontology and others will help clarify how deontology is its own theory, because up to now you may be thinking, this seems like everything I've already thought about morality, so what's new? Like, well, we're going to see that there's a difference between that way of thinking, and there are all these other ways of thinking that maybe you've never considered. Or maybe you've considered them before, but it's all just been mashed together. Like, you think about rules and you think about all these other things, that's just all morality, and it's just a big mess in your head. But maybe this distinction between theories will give you some clarity. So the second category of moral theories that I want to talk about is natural law theories. Natural law theories. These views say that there are like natural purposes and intentions behind all of the things that exist, right? That humans are a natural kind of thing, and our bodies and our minds work according to certain natural principles for how we were created or how we evolved. And morality is about living in accordance with our nature. And whenever you're doing something immoral, you're violating the sort of purpose for your own existence, or you're violating your own nature in some way. Let's give an example. The example again, sexual ethics. You've probably heard somebody at some point say that homosexuality isn't right, or it's immoral because the pieces don't fit. There it is. That's a really dumb, but a kind of natural law morality. It says that it's wrong because we weren't made to do that. Our bodies don't function that way. Slightly more sophisticated natural law ethic would say, look, human bodies are clearly made with certain capacities. One of the capacities that human bodies have is either to create eggs that can be fertilized, or to create sperm that can fertilize eggs. And clearly, you also have the anatomy to have sex, to do the thing that brings those two independent things together, and it creates a new human, and that's how humans got here. It's how you got here. And so we can discern, using our reason, the purpose for sex itself. We have a sexual drive. It's not hard to discern the purpose, because clearly when you do the thing that your drive instructs you to do, you can create a human. And so that's the purpose of sex. That's the purpose of your sexual drive, is to create human beings. And this sort of, from this view, flows out the idea that, or can flow out the idea that sex just for fun, without any intent or openness to procreating, is morally wrong, because it contradicts the whole purpose of sex. This is the view that underpins the Catholic idea that contraception is wrong, because you're just using sex for fun, and that's not what sex is for. Sex is fun. It's not wrong to have sex, enjoy it, but you also have to be open on this view to the possibility of procreation, because that's clearly what sex is for. And homosexuality is wrong because you're misusing the parts. Clearly, a penis was meant to go in a vagina and to deposit semen that will inseminate or I guess inseminate an egg, or fertilize an egg to create a new person. And now you're doing something completely different with it to get the pleasure that comes from that. So you're sort of abusing your own nature, abusing your own body, and using it in this way. That's a slightly more sophisticated natural law view. It would explain other things as wrong or right too, like being kind to your children is a good thing to do, because children clearly have needs. Children come into the world and need to be cared for. They'll die. And to be kind is just to care for them in an open, sort of honest way. To be attentive to them. That's what they need, or they'll die. So it's clearly the right thing to do, because if you don't, their bodies break down and stop working, or their minds break down and stop working. That's a natural law kind of explanation. See how different it is from an explanation that says, well, look, homosexuality is wrong because the Bible clearly says it's wrong. That's the reason why homosexuality is wrong on some deontological views. In a natural law view, you get a sort of deeper explanation that's grounded in the nature of our bodies. So when natural law what natural law says is the most important thing to think about in morality, what morality is centrally about, is everything working in accordance with its own nature. When everything works in accordance with its own nature, it's good. And when things violate their own nature or contradict their own nature, that's what badness is. So why is killing bad? Because human beings bodies tend to live on their own. You don't have to do anything other than, follow your own kind of instincts to eat and excrete and take care of yourself to keep a human body alive. It's really a remarkable thing. I mean, you're like 150 pounds of meat and you haven't rotted in like 20 years. If like you left 150 pounds of meat out in the sun, what would happen to it? It'd be like a day and it would break down. You haven't done that. Your body just keeps like being raw meat that can do all this stuff and never break down. To murder, though, is to stop all that. Is to like halt this natural process that is going along, beautifully, and to violate it, to contradict it, to cause it to end. To stab somebody in the heart is to make the heart something other than what it is, because it used to be a thing that can pump blood, and now it's a thing that just spasms weakly there or doesn't do anything at all. And that is why it's wrong, because you've violated this good natural order. And anything that's wrong on a natural view theory is wrong because it violates some natural order. And anything that's good is good because it perpetuates something in the natural order. That's the way they explain things, not in terms of rules, but in terms of natural order. So let's go into a third kind of theory that's different from all three of these. It's called virtue theory. It's one of the oldest forms of ethical theories, and it's the one that I kind of tend to gravitate towards. That doesn't mean I think you need to, but somehow it clicks with my mind fairly well. Virtue theory says this: when you're thinking about what's right or wrong, you're trying to make a moral decision, the thing that you should think, the one thing that you should concentrate on that is at the heart of all of rightness and wrongness is the notion of character. The character traits. Character being traits that you can have that are sort of stable features of your personality or your identity, and that sort of cause you to act and feel and think in a certain way at a certain time, right? So, for instance, one character trait is you can be an honest person, right? That is the trait that causes you to act in accordance with telling the truth and to be transparent and to feel bothered or hurt when somebody is dishonest with you, and to feel guilty whenever you are dishonest. And that trait stays inside you, honesty stays inside you, and over time consistently causes you to act and feel those ways. That's what a character trait is, and honesty is just one of them. Now it can be that doesn't mean that character traits don't sometimes come in conflict with each other. Like you might also think that another character trait that people should have is kindness. You shouldn't just be honest, you should also be kind. And sometimes those things obviously come in conflict with one another. And it takes this other character trait, wisdom, to know when to prioritize one or the other. But this theory is very different from either deontology or natural law theory, because where deontology says that morality is fundamentally about rules, natural law theory says morality is fundamentally about the natural order, virtue theory says morality is fundamentally about the character traits that a person embodies. Whenever something is wrong, it's because you're embodying a bad character trait. And whenever something is right or good, it's because you're embodying a good character trait. Now, we have special terms for those bad character traits and good character traits. Bad character traits are called vices, and good character traits are called virtues. That's why we call it virtue theory. That to be good is not about following rules, it's about being virtuous. So you might ask, what then are the virtues and vices that we should have? How do we know? Well, this is kind of an upside of virtue theory, is that it says it's pretty intuitive. Most societies, most people kind of automatically agree on what the list of virtues and the list of vices should be. You know, most people automatically, intuitively agree that honesty is a good thing and dishonesty is a bad thing, is a bad character trait to have in general. We don't like dishonest people, people who are consistently dishonest. We like people who are consistently trustworthy and sort of deride people who are untrustworthy. We like people who are sensitive and caring to the needs of others, who are kind, and we hate people who are like just dismiss others and don't even notice them or treat them with cruelty. So cruelty is universally considered a vice, and kindness is universally considered a virtue. Dishonesty is universally considered a vice, and honesty is universally considered a virtue. And if you just keep building out that list, you can have a pretty good idea of what virtue theory says, who virtue theory says you should be. So virtue theory is less about what you do and more about who you are. It completely reorganizes ethics around the question of who you are, not what you do. An advantage of this is that it helps you to be more subtle when you're thinking about morality than, say, a deontological theory sometimes might. Deontology would say, maybe some forms of it would say that killing another human being is wrong. Virtue theory would say, well, no, there's no rule that says, there's no good, real, true moral rule that says killing people is wrong or right. Sometimes it's the virtuous thing to do is to kill a person, and sometimes the killing a person is a vicious thing. Most of the time, killing a person is a vicious thing. So maybe it's a good rule of thumb to say that you shouldn't kill people, but it's not a firm moral rule. Sometimes it's the kind thing to do. Take a person, classic example is somebody who has been wounded in war in some mortal way. They're going to die. There's no question. They're sitting there suffering. Virtue theory says that, or you can make a case in virtue theory that the kind thing to do is to kill them, especially if they're asking. But in most other cases, killing somebody in order to enjoy, causing harm or something is a cruel thing to do, and that's on the vice list, so it's bad. So if you're acting out of a motivation that is virtuous, that's part of a virtue, it's a good thing. And if you're acting out of a motivation that's part or the product of a vice, it's a bad thing. So let's go to sexual ethics. Take homosexuality again, or sex outside of marriage, or sex just for fun. Can you think of, when you think of the list of virtues and vices, does homosexuality seem to arise from any vice? Is it cruel? Is it unkind? Is it dishonest? Is it, I don't know, mean-spirited? Think about, those are all vices. Is it, does it show a lack of self-control, or is it arrogant? No. When you go through the list of vices, it's hard to see how homosexual sex is the product of vice. It's easy to see, however, how homosexual sex could be the product of virtue. It's like love is a virtue. It's probably the supreme virtue. So that helps to clarify that issue. It's hard on any virtue theoretic account to frame homosexual sex as an immoral thing. Take again sex outside of marriage or sex just for fun. Is there any bad, vicious intention when you have sex for fun? I mean, is wanting to have fun itself a vicious or bad character trait, bad intention? It's hard to see how. I mean, fun is a pretty good thing, We like to go out and play sports for fun. That seems like a fairly okay thing. It's hard to see how that could be strictly the product of a vice? Is not wanting to have kids the product of a vice? Is it cruel? Is it dishonest? No. So as long as something isn't the product of a vice, isn't the act of a vicious intention, then it's okay. So it's hard to see how sex on those accounts is bad. Now, one vice is irresponsibility. So somebody could make the argument that having unprotected sex when you don't want to have children is a bad thing, because it shows a lack of care for your future self or for the other person or for the child that you might create. It sort of disregards them or forgets them. It's unconscientious. That's a vice. But not sex itself. Just certain instances would be wrong on virtue theory. Okay, let's go on to our fourth category of theory. This kind of theory is called a social contract. Social contract theory. Social contract theory, or theories, say that the most important fundamental thing, what morality is fundamentally about, is about living in accordance with the social agreement that we've all implicitly made with one another, just by being members of the same society. This sounds a little vague, and it is, but it's spelled out a little bit in the laws of your society, and in the way we raise our children. We sort of tell them what is expected of them as a member of society. And in Western liberal democracies, it's pretty consistently, fundamentally one thing. We've agreed not to infringe upon the freedom of others. You've probably heard someone say that your freedom ends where it begins to infringe upon my freedom. That is like the heart of the social contract in Western liberal democracies. And if you take that seriously, and if you're a social contract theorist, that's what's at the heart of morality itself. If you do something wrong, it's because it's violated part of that social contract. It's violated somebody else's freedoms. Now, you might think that the social contract that you have with everybody is more complex than that. There's no one social contract that all social contract theories say is the right one. It's up to partially what culture you're in and the viewpoint that you take. You might argue that our social contract is more complicated, more complex, and that it includes the stipulation that we owe things to each other. We don't just owe each other not to violate their freedoms. You might think that our social contract includes a sort of debt that we owe one another, or at least in certain circumstances, that we owe others something of our own. For instance, let me give you an example. If you pass by your neighbor's house and it's on fire, and you have the ability to put that fire out, and you don't, most people think that you've done something really wrong, if not criminally wrong. Well, why? You didn't infringe upon their right. You didn't do anything by walking by their house and not putting the fire out. You didn't do anything to like violate their freedom. You're just walking. Well, some people will make the argument that our social contract actually involves a debt to one another, that we help one another when we need it and have the ability to help one another. Another example from most like socialist viewpoints, everybody has a debt to one another to not let them like fall below a certain level of like quality of life. If you can help, if the society can help all of its members to maintain a minimum decent quality of life, then we owe it to one another to do that. That's kind of part of the social contract of more socialist countries than at least some people think America is. So let's go to sexual ethics then. What feature of our social contract could you imagine homosexuality, for instance, violating? Do we owe it to each other? If let's take the Western liberal sort of libertarian view that says all we owe each other is not to infringe on each other's rights. On that view, it's hard to see how consenting homosexual sex could ever infringe upon another person's rights. It just doesn't. So it's hard to see how it could be wrong on that view. And as a matter of fact, it's hard to see on any social contract view how a society would implicitly, among all of its members, not agree to not do certain things in private that they both consent to. Now, unprotected sex outside of marriage, you can imagine a society that functions with the sort of implicit agreement that everybody only have children when they have the means to take care of them. Otherwise, children become a burden. If you lived in a small community that had to be self-sufficient and went out and started making a bunch of new babies without the means to take care of them, and those people then became not burdens, but the act of keeping everybody fed and housed and healthy would then become burdensome to the society. You can see how that act could be wrong on some sort of social contract view of morality, because it violates this like implicit agreement that we all have to keep society our society that we're in functioning as healthily as possible. So in small societies, the social contract can be much easier to violate because everybody is depending on each other to a much higher degree than in a large society like America. We have 330 million people, and no one person's family choices really have any measurable effect on the whole society itself. Yeah. So what a social contract theorist wants you to do when you're faced with any moral question is to ask yourself, what do I owe other members of my society? What have I agreed to as a member of this society? And does my action, in this case, violate or uphold that sort of contract that we all implicitly agree to by simply being members of the group? Murder is pretty clearly a violation of any social contract, because any social contract involves us all letting each other live our own lives. And stopping somebody from living any life at all is a violation. Certain forms of sexual practice, though, it's hard to see how they could be, especially homosexual sex, but then more irresponsible forms of sexual practice, you can see how they could be violations of the social contract. So, the last thing that I want, the last category, or it's not really a category, it's like a view of ethics, of all ethical theories I want to introduce, is very different from others. So each of these other theories has sort of disagrees with all of the others on the question of what is at the heart of morality? What is morality and ethics about? Deontology says it's about this set of rules we have here. God gave them to me. Or reason itself shows that this set of rules is right. Kant says that. Any rational person can see that this particular rule is the right moral rule for everybody to follow. It's not about only following the rules that you could wish everybody would follow. Deontology says, here's this list of rules. That's what morality is fundamentally about. Virtue theory says good character is fundamentally what morality is about. This set of character traits that we should embody, and this set of character traits that we should absolutely expel from ourselves. That's what morality is fundamentally about. You might end up breaking good rules of thumb sometimes in order to be a virtuous person, but that's okay because you're upholding the central, the fundamental core of morality. It's about being virtuous, about having good character. And you could be good on one view and not good on another view, right? a person who just upholds the right set of rules just because they don't want God to send them to hell or something could be considered a good person on some deontological views. But doing something just because you don't want to be punished is not a virtuous sort of, or it's not a very admirable motivation. It's sort of self-centered. Right? Or following all the rules just because you want everybody to think that you're a good person and admire you and like you for more than others. You'd still be following all the rules and would be doing the right thing, would be a moral person on some deontological theories, but on virtue theory, you could follow all the rules and still have, not have the right motivations, not have the right character, and not be a good person. Natural law theory says, no, you're both wrong. What's fundamental about morality, the core of morality, the thing that morality is about the natural order of things. Either God has created a world with a natural order that needs to be upheld, or it's just part of the way reality functions. And to violate, contradict that order is just what morality is about, or immorality is about. That's what immorality is violating or contradicting that order, and upholding that order is what it means to be moral. You could be a good person on that account, upholding all morality, but you could be a bad person in upholding that. But from a deontological view, you could be considered a bad person. So these views really do disagree with each other in a lot of areas. Social contract theory is the same way. It doesn't require you to have any good sort of motivations like virtue theory does it. It doesn't require you to follow any explicit set of rules the way that deontology does. It just requires you to uphold an agreement, which is not really a set of rules. It's a sort of a condition of our coexistence. Right? It's all about society. So, how do you choose among these theories? When you come to a hard moral question, let's say you're a doctor and you're choosing between letting a person, helping a person to end their own life because they're sick and miserable and they aren't going to get any better, or keeping that person alive as long as you can because that's sort of an oath you've taken or something. How do you make that choice? Which theory should you use? Should you use the theory that says, well, life is part of the natural order and you shouldn't end it? You should let it end in its own way, however it wants to, however nature takes it. Or should you say, no, we have a commandment that says, thou shalt not kill, or we have a law that says killing another person when they haven't tried to kill you or something is wrong and illegal. So should you be a deontologist? Or should you be a virtue theorist and say, well, what would the virtuous person, what would the kind person do in this case? Or what would the brave person do in this case? What would the respectful person do in this case? Those are all virtues. Or should you ask, no, I think that covered all. So how do you choose between theories of morality? This fifth viewpoint is the one I want to kind of put forward in this class and suggest to you, is to treat all of those moral theories not as actual accounts or claims about what is right and wrong, and what the nature of rightness and wrongness is, but to treat them as tools. What I mean by that is each of those theories teaches you how to think about one important concept, either rules or natural order or character or social contracts. I think that it's okay to say all of those things are important. And we should be able to think inside all of those different frameworks. We should be able to ask a question when we come up to a hard moral decision, we should ask what rules apply here, and what character traits, what would the people with the good character traits do in this situation, and what does our social contract say about this? And what does the natural order mean in this moment? I think we should think about all of those things. But then you have the question, once I've thought about all of those things, what if one thing, what if I'm violating the social contract when I'm being a virtuous person by doing this, and I'm maybe violating the natural order, but I'm upholding the right rules when I do that? How do I choose? On this view, this fifth view that I'll call the pragmatist view of ethics, that views all these theories as tools for helping you think about a moral situation. On this view, there's like one really hard bullet that you have to bite, and it's this: moral situations hard moral situations can't be solved by some simple calculus or by straightforwardly applying some theory. If they could, they wouldn't be hard situations. And it's never a hard call to know whether you should murder your neighbor for being an asshole to you. We all know that's immoral. But the really hard situations, whether it helps somebody end their own life when they're suffering, there is no straightforward answer. And you can apply a theory and use it to tell you and just follow that theory out, but there's something sort of fundamentally, existentially inauthentic about that, because you are not a theory applying mechanism. You are a human being who has a will and who has your own values about the world, and you're going to be faced with hard choices in your life. So the bullet you have to bite here is that once you've thought about all of these different aspects of a moral decision, a moral situation, you still have to make a decision and say, this is what I'm doing, and I will accept the responsibility for doing this. And that's the end of the story. See you on Tuesday.